They fined me for tall grass, so I turned my lawn into a towering cornfield to spite them. You won't believe how this HOA battle spiraled into chaos. If you love epic HOA showdowns and petty revenge, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild neighborhood drama. Let's dive into this cornfield saga. The sun beat down on the manicured lawns of Willow Creek, a suburban enclave where every blade of grass was expected to bow to the HOA's iron rule. David Marshall, a newcomer to the neighborhood, had no intention of causing trouble when he moved into his modest two-story home. He was a quiet man, a software engineer who preferred debugging code to tending his yard. His lawn, a patchy mix of clover and crabgrass, was never his priority. But to the Willow Creek HOA, it was a crime scene. The first warning arrived in his mailbox just 3 months after he settled in. A crisp official letter citing excessive grass height and demanding immediate action. David glanced at his lawn, barely an inch taller than his neighbor's, and shrugged. He mowed it that weekend, assuming the matter was settled. But the HOA wasn't done. Another letter arrived, this time with a $50 fine for non-compliance with community standards. The violation? A few stray weeds. David's blood simmered. He wasn't a gardener, but he wasn't a slob either. The HOA's relentless nitpicking felt personal, like a challenge to his right to exist in their pristine bubble. He paid the fine but began researching his options. The HOA bylaws were a labyrinth of rules, but one detail caught his eye. No explicit ban on crops. Lawns were to be well maintained, but the definition was vague. A mischievous idea took root. If they wanted to play petty, he'd play smarter. David spent weeks studying agricultural forums, learning about fast-growing crops that could thrive in his yard. Corn, he decided, was perfect. Tall, legal, and impossible to ignore. By spring, he'd tilled his front lawn under the cover of night, planting rows of sweet corn seeds in neat furrows. He installed a drip irrigation system, discreetly hidden beneath the soil, and waited. The HOA didn't notice at first. Sprouts emerged, blending into the grass, but by early summer, the corn stalks were knee-high, their vibrant green leaves swaying in the breeze. Neighbors began to whisper. Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, drove by daily, her eyes narrowing at the unusual greenery. David kept his head down, tending his corn with care, fertilizing and weeding meticulously. The stalks grew taller, reaching his waist, then his chest. By July, they towered over 6 feet, casting shadows across the street. The first official complaint arrived, a furious letter demanding he remove the unauthorized agricultural installation. David smirked. The bylaws didn't forbid crops, only required a maintained appearance. His corn was pristine, rose straight as a ruler. He ignored the letter. Karen escalated, sending a certified notice with a $200 fine and a deadline to comply. David responded with a polite email, citing the bylaws and attaching photos of his immaculate cornfield. The HOA board, a clique of self-appointed lawn czars, was livid. They called an emergency meeting, inviting David to defend his violation. He declined, knowing they'd twist his words. Instead, he doubled down, adding sunflowers along the edges for extra flair. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some admired David's audacity. Others, loyal to Karen, saw it as an attack on their property values. Tension simmered, but David's corn stood tall, a living monument to his defiance. By late summer, the stalks were heavy with ears, their golden tassels glinting in the sun. Karen's daily drive-bys became hourly. The HOA was plotting their next move, and David knew they wouldn't back down easily. The cornfield was now the talk of Willow Creek, a spectacle drawing curious onlookers from neighboring subdivisions. David's front yard, once a forgettable patch of grass, had transformed into a lush 8-foot-tall jungle of corn and sunflowers. Cars slowed as they passed, some drivers snapping photos, others shaking their heads. David found himself oddly proud, tending his crop each evening with a watering can, his quiet rebellion blooming under the summer sun. The HOA, however, was in full war mode. Karen Whitmore, a woman whose authority hinged on her clipboard and her ability to intimidate, rallied the board to tighten their grip. They issued a new rule overnight, amending the bylaws to ban non-ornamental plants in front yards. The change was suspiciously specific, clearly aimed at David's corn. Another letter arrived, this time threatening legal action and a $500 fine if the corn wasn't removed within a week. David consulted a lawyer friend who confirmed the HOA's new rule was shaky. Retroactively enforcing it on an existing setup could be challenged in court. Emboldened, David refused to comply. He posted a sign in his yard, "Willow Creek Community Farm, free corn coming soon." The sign was a masterstroke, turning his rebellion into a public stunt. Neighbors who'd been on the fence began to rally behind him, some out of genuine support, others just to spite Karen's reign. Social media caught wind, with photos of the cornfield going viral under hashtags like #HORREVENGE and her corngate. A local news van even showed up, filming a segment about the suburban farmer fighting back. Karen was apoplectic. Her pristine neighborhood was becoming a circus, and she was the unwilling ringleader. She doubled down, hiring a lawyer to draft a cease and desist order, claiming the corn violated community aesthetics. David's lawyer friend laughed it off, advising him to keep records of every interaction. Meanwhile, David's corn was ready to harvest. He spent a weekend picking ears, stacking them in baskets on his driveway with a new sign, "Free corn for neighbors." The gesture was a hit. Families stopped by thanking him for the fresh produce, some sharing stories of their own HOA grievances. The corn was sweet, juicy, a triumph of petty vengeance. But Karen wasn't done. She reported David to the city, claiming his farm violated zoning laws. A city inspector visited, but to David's relief, the property was zoned for residential use with no explicit ban on small-scale gardening. The inspector, amused by the saga, wished David luck and left. The HOA's legal threats loomed larger, though. Karen's lawyer sent a formal notice of a lawsuit, claiming the cornfield devalued neighboring properties. David knew he couldn't ignore this forever. He began researching legal precedents, spending nights poring over HOA horror stories online. The community was now split, half cheering his defiance, half siding with Karen's vision of uniformity. As autumn approached, the cornstalks began to dry, their golden hues fading to brown. David faced a choice: cut them down and admit defeat, or escalate further. The lawsuit's shadow hung heavy, but so did his resolve. With the corn harvested, David's front yard stood as a field of brittle stalks, a stark reminder of his defiance. The HOA's lawsuit was moving forward, with Karen pushing for an injunction to force David to restore his lawn to grass. The board hired an appraiser to argue that the cornfield had slashed property values, though the evidence was flimsy. Home prices in Willow Creek were climbing despite the drama. David's lawyer friend helped him file a countersuit, arguing the HOA's retroactive rule change was unenforceable and their harassment constituted abuse of power. The legal battle was costly, draining David's savings, but he wasn't backing down. He cleared the corn stalks, not out of surrender, but to plant a new crop, winter wheat. The golden waves of grain sprouted quickly, keeping his yard within the vague, well-maintained clause of the bylaws. The wheat was less ostentatious than the corn, but no less provocative, signaling he was in this for the long haul. Karen's campaign intensified. She organized a petition, collecting signatures from loyalists to pressure David into compliance. The petition claimed his farming antics were a blight on the community's image. But David's free corn had won hearts, and many neighbors refused to sign, some openly mocking Karen at HOA meetings. The viral attention grew, with Reddit threads and YouTube videos dissecting the saga. A local farmer's market invited David to sell his wheat, turning his rebellion into a small side hustle. He donated the proceeds to a community garden project, further cementing his folk hero status. The lawsuit dragged on, with both sides exchanging discovery documents. David's lawyer uncovered emails showing Karen had pushed the bylaw change specifically to target him, a potential violation of HOA governance rules. The revelation weakened her case, but she pressed forward, her ego too entrenched to retreat. Meanwhile, David's wheat grew tall, its feathery head swaying in the winter breeze. The neighborhood was now a battleground of ideologies, conformity versus individuality. Some neighbors started small gardens of their own, inspired by David's stand. Karen's patrols grew frantic, her clipboard filled with new violations as she tried to reassert control. The court date loomed, set for early spring. David prepared meticulously, gathering photos, bylaws, and neighbor testimonials. He also installed a small scarecrow in his yard, a cheeky nod to his farm. The scarecrow became a local landmark, with kids posing for photos and pranksters dressing it up at night. Karen's fury peaked when she saw it wearing a tiny HOA badge. The community was fracturing, but David felt a strange peace. His yard, once a source of stress, was now his canvas, a testament to his refusal to bow. As the wheat ripened, he planned his next move, knowing the courtroom would decide his fate. Spring arrived, and with it the courtroom showdown. David's wheat field, now golden and ready for harvest, stood as a quiet symbol of his resistance as he headed to the county courthouse. The HOA's lawyer painted him as a reckless rebel, arguing his crops disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony and lowered property values. The appraiser's report was their centerpiece, but David's lawyer dismantled it, pointing out the lack of concrete data tying the corn or wheat to any financial loss. Home sales in Willow Creek had, in fact, risen slightly, likely due to the viral attention. David's countersuit took center stage, accusing the HOA of overreach and targeting him unfairly. The leaked emails were damning, showing Karen's personal vendetta in stark detail. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a knack for cutting through bluster, seemed skeptical of the HOA's claims. She questioned the retroactive bylaw change and noted the lack of clear violations in the original rules. After 2 days of testimony, she ruled in David's favor, striking down the HOA's new rule as unenforceable and dismissing their lawsuit. The countersuit was partially successful, awarding David legal fees but stopping short of punitive damages. The courtroom victory was sweet, but the war wasn't over. Karen resigned as HOA president, her reputation in tatters, but her allies on the board vowed to rewrite the bylaws again. David returned home to harvest his wheat, sharing it with neighbors who'd supported him. The community garden he'd funded flourished, a symbol of change in Willow Creek. Some neighbors tore up their lawns for vegetable patches, inspired by his rebellion. Others grumbled, still loyal to the old guard. David's yard returned to grass, not out of defeat but because he'd made his point. He kept a small corner for sunflowers, a quiet reminder of his victory. The HOA, chastened but not dissolved, operated with less zeal under new leadership. David's saga lived on online, with Corngate trending for months. He occasionally got emails from strangers asking for advice on fighting their own HOAs. Life settled back into routine, but David's defiance had left a mark. Willow Creek was no longer just a sea of identical lawns. It was a place where individuality could take root, one seed at a time. If you enjoyed this wild HOA saga, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more epic neighborhood battles. Drop a comment with your own HOA horror stories. We'd love to hear them.